ask a question that I did not prepare, but just kind of occurs to me as we're talking. There is such a thing as very clearly objectionable practices, such as literally shouting someone down, not allowing their event to proceed, unplugging their microphones, swarming their hall, all those sorts of things. But there's also this more nebulous zone of free association, social approval or disapproval, that is not necessarily a violation of free speech, but I think many HXA members feel, at least in certain circumstances, like there's a certain grace or charity or tolerance that even if you're allowed to not practice, you should, because there's just something to be said for looking for that kernel of truth or wisdom, even when somebody seems crazy or you don't trust them, or it's an argument that you're just not persuaded by. That's where it gets really hard to navigate those issues for me, more so than the very clear-cut violations. I mean, is there something, and maybe I can go back to you, Roslyn. I mean, you run a community that I've listened to a couple of your other podcasts, and you've described as, loving and inclusive in different ways, and very focused on, education and educational outcomes. I mean, how do you think about that issue in your context, when it's not just following the rules, but those norms that are a little harder to pin down?
I think civility is critically important, and I use that in a very generic sense. And I think you have to do some work to ensure that. We have certainly had guests to our campus that have been unwelcomed in many respects. And we did the work up front, and that's not a back pat or, but it was at a time period where things were very, very volatile. And so pulling our students together and saying, listen, the world is watching. We will stand and demonstrate that we are respectful and decent and civil, and that we can engage in a discourse that may not be, we may have disagreements, but we won't be disagreeable. I mean, that's also cachet and flip. But we've really spent a lot of time having that conversation and allowing students to express themselves kind of beforehand. And then we did have a conversation about consequences, right? I used consequences at that time and said, this is not who we will be. If you don't like it, you don't have to come. If you choose to divorce yourself from this event, if you choose to not be on campus that day, that's fine. There will be no consequence to that. But we will not tolerate destruction of property. We will not tolerate disrespectful behavior. We will not tolerate physical harm of any kind to anyone. We will not tolerate things that have the likelihood to cast this institution in a very negative light on a national or global stage. And so, we let students express themselves sort of in advance. And I think there is no substitute for putting in the work. There's no substitute for having the tough conversations with students. And, I have the luxury of leading a small institution. We're 2,000 students. So it's a little easier for me than perhaps it is for Chapel Hill, right? To come together and have an assembly and say, let's all get on page before we have this, really controversial speaker. I'm just lucky, I guess, in that regard. But I do think faculty can be tremendous allies and advocates in this effort. I think, at all levels of the academic experience, including, student affairs and co-curricular activities, you have to be willing to have the competition, do the work, and not tolerate or accept behavior that is inconsistent with the practice of civility and grace and decency.
I think so much of this is setting expectations and the guidelines and people knowing the rules. So I think, Rosalind, that's an amazing job that you do that. But I think telling people, we passed a law in North Carolina where you're supposed to, each university during orientation is supposed to tell them, spend time explaining free expression and what's allowed, right? And like what UNC does, which I think is insufficient, it was like one slide of literally 2 sentences in orientation run by Student Life and Leadership. And, it doesn't say anything about the heckler's veto, what is and isn't allowed. So it's like, you've got to do it. And then you've got to also say the rules are, if this happens, and then as I think Roslyn said, tell them what the consequences are of breaking the rules.
I think for the most part at Western, we haven't really had any incidents where we've had speakers shut down. We haven't really had a lot of overt protest. There's been some threat of protest from student groups that just kind of didn't happen. So I think, I don't know if we're just lucky that way, or if students are coming around more to the idea that they should be open to other perspectives. But it certainly, when I have students in a classroom and we talk about this idea of being confronted with speakers or events that go against what our personal morals or ideals might be, you have the choice not to go. You have the choice not to engage. You also have the choice to go and learn something new and maybe test out your own perspective and make sure that what you think is actually a valid thing to think, right? So if it's incorporating the rules, sure, but also again instilling the idea that you need to challenge yourself and challenge what you think you know to be true in order to grow as individuals.